In a single instant, the sky caught fire. Not the slow burn of a spreading blaze, not the familiar glow of dawn or dusk, but a violent light that erased shadows before they could move, that shattered stone, that turned the very air into a weapon. A city that had been alive only moments before, its walls standing firm, its homes filled with breath and movement, was lifted out of history without warning. Whatever happened next unfolded too quickly to be understood, yet with a force too overwhelming to ever be forgotten. Those standing on the plains east of the Dead Sea may have looked upward in instinctive terror, shielding their eyes as the heavens themselves appeared to rupture. What they witnessed did not resemble lightning. It did not resemble the sun. It was something else entirely, an unbearable brilliance, followed by a wave of heat that raced across the land faster than sound, faster than thought. And then, where a city had stood, there was suddenly nothing recognizable at all. For thousands of years, the memory of that moment survived, not in stone or metal, but in words. Ancient verses spoke of fire and brimstone raining from the sky, of smoke rising like a furnace, of a once fertile plain rendered lifeless. The story came to be known as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah tale, treated alternately as sacred truth or symbolic allegory, depending on who was listening. For generations, scholars dismissed it as myth. A moral story, they said. A cautionary tale wrapped in supernatural imagery. Cities do not simply vanish in an instant. Fire does not fall from a clear sky. Landscapes are not poisoned for centuries by a single event. And yet, the land itself never seemed to forget. At the northeastern edge of the Dead Sea, in a region once known in ancient texts as the Kicker of the Jordan, archaeologists began uncovering something that did not behave like a myth. Beneath layers of soil lay the remains of a vast Bronze Age city larger than Jerusalem or Jericho had been at the time. Fortified, prosperous, and strategically positioned along trade routes that had flourished for nearly 3,000 years. Its name, reconstructed from the site and surrounding records, was Tol el-Hammam. For centuries, this city-state had thrived. It had survived wars, droughts, political upheaval. Its people had rebuilt after hardship, generation after generation, as cities always do. And then, around the middle of the 17th century BCE, it disappeared. Not gradually, not in decline. It ended abruptly. Excavators did not find the familiar signatures of conquest. There were no arrowheads embedded in walls, no orderly layers of rebuilding. Instead, what emerged from the ground looked less like a ruin and more like a frozen moment of annihilation. Across the entire site lay a thick blanket, nearly 5 feet in some places, of carbonized ash, pulverized mud brick, and debris fused together as if by unimaginable heat. Pottery fragments had melted and warped, their surfaces transformed into greenish glass. Mud bricks had not merely cracked or burned. They had boiled, expanded, and in some cases exploded so violently that parts of them seemed to have vaporized. Human remains, where they existed at all, were fragmented and scattered, not buried with intention, but torn apart by force. Temperatures here had exceeded 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the flows of most volcanoes. This was not the aftermath of a fire set by human hands. Bronze Age furnaces could not reach such heat. Even the most destructive citywide infernos known to archaeology left different fingerprints: charcoal, collapsed beams, slow layers of ash. What happened at Tol el-Hammam was something else entirely. The city had not burned. It had been flashes. As researchers pieced together the evidence, a disturbing question emerged. If no army had done this, and no ordinary fire could explain it, then what had struck this place with such speed and intensity? The answer, proposed cautiously by some, and fiercely debated by others, pointed not toward the horizon, but upward, toward the sky. One hypothesis suggested that a cosmic object, a comet fragment or meteor roughly the size of a multi-story building, had entered Earth's atmosphere at tremendous velocity and exploded before impact. Not a crater-forming collision, but an airburst, similar in nature to the Tunguska event that flattened forests in Siberia in 1908. The force of such an explosion would have been staggering, more powerful than 1,000 Hiroshima-scale nuclear detonations combined. In this scenario, the object never touched the ground. Instead, it detonated in the air above the city, releasing a downward-directed jet of superheated plasma that raced toward the surface like an invisible flamethrower. Buildings would have been torn apart by a shockwave moving faster than sound. Stones weighing hundreds of kilograms could have been hurled through the air. Flesh, wood, and cloth would have vanished almost instantly. The ground itself would have suffered. Minerals exposed to pressures and temperatures normally found only in nuclear blasts or asteroid impacts were discovered embedded in the soil. Shocked quartz, microdiamonds, melted metals, subtle microscopic signatures that told a story far removed from legend. Even traces of rare elements, associated with extraterrestrial material, appeared scattered across the destruction layer. But the devastation did not end when the firestorm passed. Nearby lay the Dead Sea, bordered by hypersaline soils rich in salt. The airburst's heat would have flash vaporized these salts, lofting them high into the atmosphere before they fell back to Earth as a toxic rain. Fields were poisoned. Crops failed. The Jordan Valley, once densely settled, was abandoned across a radius of more than 15 miles. For 600 years, no one returned. Cities and villages across the region fell silent, not because people forgot how to live there, but because the land itself had turned against them. It was as if the earth had been deliberately salted, an unsettling detail for anyone familiar with the ancient story. In Genesis, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is followed by a land rendered barren, a place where nothing grows. Smoke rises like a furnace. Fire falls from heaven. The city is wiped clean. Even the geographical description, the location northeast of the Dead Sea, within the fertile plain of the Jordan lines, with the archaeological site in uncomfortable ways. Of course, not all scholars agree. Some challenge the interpretation of the mineral evidence. Others argue that the data are suggestive, but not conclusive. Science, after all, advances through disagreement, not certainty. The physics of the airburst are debated. The geochemistry scrutinized. Alternative explanations proposed and tested. But even among critics, one fact remains difficult to dismiss. Something violent happened here. Something sudden. Something capable of erasing a major city in moments and rendering an entire region uninhabitable for centuries. If an airburst did destroy Tol El Hammam, then the people who witnessed it would have had no framework to understand what they were seeing. They did not know of meteors, shockwaves, or plasma jets. They knew only that the sky had unleashed destruction without warning, that fire had come from above, and that survival itself felt like a judgment. Stories like that do not fade icily. They are told and retold. They shift shape, absorb meaning, and travel across generations. Long before anyone wrote them down, they lived in memory in the voices of survivors explaining the unexplainable to their children, and their children's children, not as a scientific report, but as a warning. And if that is true, then perhaps the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not a myth invented to teach morality, but a memory of a day when the sky truly did fall, and the only language available to describe it was the language of the divine.
Long Esther thề pha phế đất phẩm mè mò gì, thề gờ dồn ít sinh kiếp thể vờ đơn, ét và si gờ lăn, tô đền đến ham mầm lúc lại mền Aten chân ruôn si cá tất cơ dầu si thè ni y si đến a club city, về tất bì tâm, ít si tồn bờ dầu cân ẩn bề zít bi nít sen chi si ấp đà si, bắt ai si archaeology si đắc điệp lên bi lên, ít bi kem cơ lì giác ti si o si nát anh pơ lệ si xếp bi si lầu đờ kê, ít o si anh pơ lệ si phơ lầu sân bi van lần. What te ân ca vất đít nát gì xem bân the ép tờ mắt ấp u te u nó cơ li sàn ấp in về đinh amisi nó ô đờ li bạ tân ấp đi si tờ rắc sân nó gơ ra nguồn di bin dim phê sa si lết ớt tắp hoàn ân tờ in si tết cơ dầu si thẻ in tăng sát te o si ảnh sinh gần ẩn mi si đề cơ bẩn hạ sân in thê son đến a đi si tờ rắc sân lên so ở bờ giáp so yêu na phôm rát ít mắc ảnh tờ di sa si màu mân ven lắp hi si táp ti si lem o si thích in sam e di si ni li pháp phít deep ít cần cc tất ấp cả bản nát ec xa tất mắt bờ dích toàn vát si tôn under bờ gì filter ghế tờ bị hit so in tên rát nổ mần mà ti riêng bị hết in ép nổ mần ui si ít oxy nát simple liban ít oxy chăn si foam pat y phờ lắc mần tàu ở bắt ấp thẻ si tô di cờ lê về sân one phát ân hạ đần in bờ gian ekin hát và si li mền tất ở ghế đến bắt ti si tam ân y vân li tê sa phật sa si bờ li si tất ẩn wop gờ lết inta anh gờ gì ni si gờ là si sắm sát của filter ghế tờ ICXTH bờ di phờ li phờ lốt before cooling in per lesi, TC alone tốt anh bờ ra bờ lâm, en chân kin cút di him bờ dê ship tem per chassis, bắt nạt thiên cơ lậu si tọ what hút bè di quát to mê ôn dê đi đến phát xe mic on anh si tiết si ken, mắt bờ dích tàu an evin si tờ dền gờ tên, the biên đinh ấp tổ đến đến ham âm u cân si tờ rắc tất bờ ra mê dân li phâm sun đến đờ dắt bờ dích đến a mic chưa ấp cơ lê, si tờ rô, ẩn u tô xếp ẩn lết to hạ đần in the sun, under no man condition. Và các si sạt bờ dích to cờ rắc cơ giảm bần si lâu ly, bắt hi, mền HB hết đi phên ly, THX si bàn đất và lần ly, xăm bờ si tinh ấp bắt mít đến si tờ rắc chờ, si sâu in sàn ấp having bờ di phơ ly bỏ phâm thè in sắt ốt, in x si tờ dìm kê sơ si, ô sân ấp thè bờ dích ấp ít tỏ hấp về phát, phở rát to hạp ân, temperature si hát to si bắc ồn màu si in si tân tàn đi si ly, nát hander rất ấp đi ggc, thâu sân, mê sơ mân ân mati diên ân alasa si sắc ghê si tất x si bầu sơ to hít x si đinh 3,6 đi ggc phê dân hát, hạt ở than màu si văn canic là vơ, hạt ở than nên nino nên chân human đến mết pha, ân cơ du sân ly, tc hít đít nát linger, x si tờ giác pha si, big ân van đi si, living behind mati riêng rát hát no tâm to fully cầm ba si ở club in ảnh gờ ra quân ue, human zimen, ue phone, ufer lakman tê di ân unsettling, si kê lỡ tân u nát nít ly bề zít thì vinlet in tắc bi nít phả lần u, to si cá tất, bờ dâu cân, sam tam di đô si to bà sân di men uít no cơ li orientation, tco si nát the bà tân ấp people chấp in club sinh bin đinh ở si lên bi weapon. Ít lúc mô lai bà DC cắt in anh và lần phô si giác tổ thơ du thè si ti ui thốt DC cơ di mần đế sân. Thè sắt di xem bâng lê si anh duôn ẩn mua anh phô dên xích cơ giam xin. Ý vin thè DC tơ dơ biêu sân ấp đà bơ di bòn tất tỏ xàm thinh ẩn yếu quân. Hay vì si tôn ấp ghét đến gơ dàn đình si tôn uê in hẳn đờ rất ấp kỳ là gơ giam đến ua phôn DC bơ lê si phà phâm quê tê sút hấp bần. Vùng hát nắt sim bơ ly phà lần ý nuốt. Tê hát bần bơ lồn ở bát. Đếc sân ân đa mắc sớt ghê si tất ảnh to phần xa quét moving ở cơ dầu si thè city. Phở lát ninh si tờ rắc cha si in ảnh cân si tần ô diên tê sân bí phổ đi sập bề tình. Tì si zết an uncomfortable possibility. Sa quếp lại tì si yêu dê honest. Tê ở nát tờ ra đu si bí ất quếch. Quy sách thè gờ dồn bắt do nát ghê nết x si tờ dìm hít. Tê ở nát tờ ra đu si bí ổ đàn nề dĩ x si per lâu sân. Win lip cờ dê ta si ân căn sân chế tất đá mắc sơn. Ân tê ở nát tờ ra đu si bí pha si. Quy si per zết tớ út ân áp uất. Consuming fuel over tam. Mắt căn ấp event cút cầm bàn si dìm hít. Imen Bergeser ân anh Citiot Berlasi đến ổn in anh Mater ấp second. ICG Searchasi cần tì níu tê analysasi. Marker Jasi cặp x Everden edet anater lên ấp in chick. Embedded uy tin the son urgen ấp cốt bề dinh săn ấp sắc deformation. Under x Citer Jim Bergeser. The internal cờ di si tân Citer rắc chớ ấp cốt trên Gasi in si Pacific. Dê các nạc sơ bần ui si. TC sắc cốt gen ơ màu si commonly associated with nuclear detonation Citot impact. Ở lồng sắt the mutani daman đến marker dâu đến daman phôm ven carbon EC subjected to sudden intense men tất đờ dập alert up mê tân uống on sâu tờ di sen ICUN ICG si phê di cần catacaren zit with element like isidium unper latanum subsitan sasimo abandon in exciter zate si the ziemati diên than inert e si cơ gia si none up TC funding alone per rút anh casimic event battagator tê phôm anh tà tần rát ủ si đi phờ cầm tỏ igno sitin si kết TC sầm gì men Samsan TC Angyut Zat cần tam sân, mi xin tập ở sân, ở nữ quân lâu cần đi sân cút x shipper lên bắt ấp thẻ và đơn, Atasipon tất ốt Zat Exeter dầu đơn này di cơ lên di qua Exeter dầu đơn này di per giúp, TK sân gender rơi cần cơ lu sân tù quỷ cơ ly, Asipe sali ven the na ra tiếp sim to ở lan sonit li with anh phê mà si bị bơ là cần si tô gì, ẩn yết, the archaeology ít xem gì phiút to xà phân, TOC no và đơn upper ra lồng xích, no chan si sân đơn akia bê sân layer. Nó gơ giang quân ở bán đơn mân, tổ đền đến hàm mầm đít nát đi cờ lan, ít đít nát gì lầu kết, ít đít nát gì bì, ít xì tắp, the đi xì tờ rắc sân lên xin the city lại anh lít on anh tum, ở bắp ít, sen chỉ xì bà xì, đa xì xê tâu, nu xê đâm mân accumulated, embassy dầu xì ân phền NCUE, bắt hi, nothing gì tần, the lan on the city, văn phật tán ân đến xì li bạp yên lệ tất, dì mên ép tì phường ghề nê sân. Son Sampong di viên nhiễu quân lý hà sông căn sân chê sân đến lề băng kê ba bần ấp kỳ linh cơ dấp ân phờ di bên tình di gở dốt. Sông, si cả tất ơ cơ dầu si thè lăn si kép, nát bì hiểu mần hàn, bắt bì phô si. Ít u si e si ít thè cờ ta si tờ giờ phi hát nát only đi si tờ rót thè city. Bắt đi li bờ rất liền suốt ít cút nề vô di cover. Tò tàu si hù lít in thè bờ dàn ếch. Sang an y bên út hấp bần in cầm bờ giờ hen si bần. Tể hát nó lăng gúc phơ ét mà si phê dích ít si bờ lâu sân. Nó cần xếp ấp casimic double zin tin the sika, ôn tê cút ấp sub oxy casi ẩn effect, the heaven furlet, the city vanisi, the landat, in zat can te si, meaning út hấp bần inevitable, disasi tự on zat si ken disi nat zi men anh gian đầm accident in human memory, ít đi man exhibition, ít đi man anh si to zi zat can hou phi, losi, unsababan on s1, overtime, the ra đi tên bơ lơ. Bắt the emotion đơn chút gì men đến the sen dắt something greater than human conflict hat intervene. Ăn sọ the gờ dồn binito đến ham mầm DC mô than per giờ sắp bờ dầu cân bờ dích ẩn mền tất tà tì. Ít per giờ sắp ảnh moment ven the boulder gì between đặt dần cataciter giờ phi ẩn đi van interpretation đi some completely. Ven the physical đi li bất an xcp dân sau với mình dắt ít cút only be under si tút IC gắc mân. Người tơ the ăn tâm mất ca si kem phẩm thẻ si ca a phẩm phổ si 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 tin đa bề tít, thẻ và đơn lết bi hắn tê như si ti si mặt quýt sa tân ti si ổ si nát ảnh metaphor, something zin happen he, anua tê vơ ít ổ si, ít trên hầu people gì mềm bất thẻ si ca phân vơ.
If the ground recorded the aftermath, the sky may have been the origin. The idea is unsettling because it shifts the cause of destruction beyond the familiar. Wars are human. Fires are local. Earthquakes rise from below. But what happened at Tal el Hammam appears to have come from above, arriving without warning and leaving no enemy to blame. To consider that possibility is to imagine a Bronze Age world suddenly confronted with a force entirely outside its experience. A stone falling from heaven, not striking the earth like a spear, but exploding in the air with catastrophic precision. In modern terms, this kind of event is known as a cosmic airburst. A meteor or comet fragment enters Earth's atmosphere at extreme speed, heats rapidly, and detonates before impact. The explosion releases energy outward and downward, flattening landscapes without leaving a crater. The most famous example occurred in 1908 over the Tunguska region of Siberia, where an airburst leveled more than 800 square miles of forest. Trees were snapped like matchsticks and laid out in a radial pattern pointing away from the blast's epicenter. No crater was ever found. At Tunguska there were no cities beneath the sky. No walls, no pottery, no written memory preserved in scripture. But if the same kind of event had occurred over a populated Bronze Age city, the result would have been far more than an ecological scar. It would have been a cultural rupture. Some researchers estimate that the object responsible for the destruction of Tal el Hammam may have been roughly 50 meters across. Traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, it would have compressed the air in front of it until the atmosphere itself became incandescent. When it finally disintegrated, the release of energy would have rivaled or exceeded the combined force of 1,000 nuclear deaths. The physics of such an explosion are difficult to visualize. Even today, the air becomes superheated plasma. Pressure spikes beyond comprehension. A shock wave forms and races outward faster than sound. For those below, there would have been no warning, no rumble, no time to flee. Just a flash brighter than the sun, followed by annihilation. Buildings would not have collapsed slowly. They would have been torn apart. Stone walls would have disintegrated. Wooden beams would have vanished. Human bodies, exposed to heat and pressure simultaneously, would have been shattered and scattered in ways that defy ordinary patterns of death. And then, just as suddenly, it would have been over. The sky would clear. The fire would vanish. Silence would return. What remained would look unreal. This model helps explain the peculiar combination of evidence found at Tal el Hammam. Extreme heat without prolonged burning, widespread directional damage, shock-formed minerals, and the absence of a crater. It also explains the scale. An event powerful enough to devastate a city would also affect the surrounding region, blasting salt from nearby hypersaline soils and spreading it across farmland like a curse carried by the wind. Yet for all its explanatory power, the airburst hypothesis remains controversial. Some scientists argue that the mineral signatures could be misidentified, or that similar effects might occur under rare terrestrial conditions. Others caution that linking a specific archaeological site to a cosmic event requires an extraordinary standard of proof. They point out that Tunguska itself remains imperfectly understood more than a century later. The debate is ongoing, and it should be. But what matters here is not whether the airburst explanation ultimately prevails. What matters is that the destruction of Tal el Hammam forces us to confront a broader question. How ancient people process catastrophes that had no visible cause. When something falls from the sky and erases a city, there is no enemy to fight, no king to blame, no mistake to correct. There is only the overwhelming sense that the heavens themselves have acted. In such moments, interpretation becomes inevitable. To the survivors scattered across the Jordan Valley, the event would not have felt random. Randomness is a luxury of hindsight. In the moment, meaning presses in from all sides. Why this city? Why this day? Why were some spared while others vanished? Without science, answers come from story. Over time, the details of the event would shift. The blinding light becomes fire. The shockwave becomes divine breath. The poisonous rain of salt becomes judgment. What begins as an eyewitness account slowly transforms into a moral narrative, shaped by the values and fears of each generation that retells it. This is how memory survives catastrophe. Not as a precise record, but as a framework that can be carried forward. The biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah is striking not because it is dramatic, but because it is restrained. There is no long battle, no drawn-out punishment. The cities are destroyed swiftly, decisively, in a single moment. Fire falls from heaven, Smoke rises. The land is ruined. The survivors flee and do not return. Even the strange detail of a woman turning to salt reads differently in this context. Salt was everywhere after the event. Salt in the soil. Salt in the air. Salt killing the land. A human figure associated with salt becomes a symbol, not a literal transformation, but a way of expressing how completely the region was claimed by it. If this interpretation is even partially correct, then the story preserved in Genesis is not an invention, but an echo. A memory carried across centuries, translated from observation into theology. And Tal el-Hemmam would not be unique. Throughout human history, rare but devastating natural events have repeatedly been woven into myth. Volcanic eruptions become battles of gods. Earthquakes become writhing monsters beneath the earth. Floods become divine resets. Each culture uses the language available to it to describe the indescribable. In that sense, the question is not whether ancient people exaggerated what they saw. The question is how little they may have exaggerated at all. Imagine standing on the plain that day, watching the sky flare brighter than anything you have ever known, feeling the heat sear your skin from miles away, and then seeing an entire city vanish in a matter of heartbeats. Imagine the silence afterward, broken only by distant echoes and the wind carrying ash across the land. What would you call it? An accident implies predictability. A natural disaster implies familiarity. But when the sky itself becomes the source of destruction, the only word that fits is judgment, not because a god must be involved, but because the human mind demands meaning when faced with annihilation. Perhaps that is why the story endured. Not because people feared divine wrath, but because they feared forgetting what the sky was capable of. And if a single stone from space could erase a city and poison a land for centuries, then the heavens were no longer distant or benign. They were participants in human history, watching, waiting, capable of ending everything without warning. Apocalypse does not always fall from the sky. Sometimes it arrives from the horizon, almost politely at first, moving so slowly that no one believes it will ever truly come. The water rises an inch, then another. Shorelines retreat. Rivers swell. Fields become marshes. Life adjusts, because it always has. And then, one day, the sea decides to move. Long before written history recorded kings and wars, a vast inland basin sat quietly between what we now call Europe and Asia. It was not a sea yet, but a massive freshwater lake, fed by rivers, surrounded by fertile plains and deltas. Villages lined its shores. People fished its waters, farmed its edges, and built their lives with the confidence that comes from stability. To them, the land was not temporary. But beyond the narrow strait to the south, something was changing. As the last ice age loosened its grip, glaciers melted and oceans rose. The Mediterranean Sea crept higher year by year, pressing against a natural barrier at a narrow choke point. For centuries, that barrier held water pooled on one side, land remained dry on the other. The balance seemed permanent. Until it wasn't. When the barrier finally failed, it did not fail gently. Saltwater surged northward with unimaginable force, tearing through the opening like a released floodgate. What followed was not a slow spill, but a roaring wall of water and inland tsunami driven not by wind or earthquake, but by gravity itself. The sea poured into the basin at a rate comparable to hundreds of massive waterfalls combined, carving deep channels as it advanced. Day after day, the shoreline retreated. Fields vanished beneath waves. Villages were swallowed. The water advanced nearly a mile at a time, erasing homes and livelihoods with mechanical indifference. For those who lived along the edge, there was no dramatic moment when the world ended, only the relentless realization that it was ending anyway. Archaeological and geological evidence suggests that this transformation happened roughly 7,500 years ago. Sediment cores taken from the basin floor reveal a sudden shift. Freshwater shells abruptly replaced by marine species. River clays buried beneath layers of saltwater mud. It was not a gradual blending of ecosystems. It was a replacement. A world overwritten. For the people who lived there, the experience would have felt absolute. Imagine waking each morning to find the sea closer than it had been the night before. Imagine packing what you can carry, moving inland, only to realize that the water is faster than your migration. There are no maps to consult, no distant reports to warn you. Only the sound of water where land used to be. To modernize, this was not a global catastrophe. It did not drown the entire planet. But scale is relative to perspective. For a farming community whose entire world was bounded by a familiar horizon, the loss of that world was total. Civilizations do not need to disappear everywhere to be remembered as destroyed. Some researchers believe that this event, the sudden flooding of the basin, may have submerged tens of thousands of square miles of land. Others argue for a smaller inundation, less dramatic in area but still devastating in impact. The debate continues, fueled by new data and reinterpreted evidence. But no one disputes the core truth. The water came, and after it arrived, nothing was the same. Around the same period, something curious appears in the archaeological record, far beyond the flooded shores. New cultures, tools, and settlement patterns emerge across wide regions, as if people had arrived suddenly from elsewhere. Farming practices shift. Myths begin to circulate, stories of great floods, of chosen survivors, of divine warnings ignored until it was too late. One story, in particular, would endure. It tells of a world undone by water, of fountains breaking open beneath the earth, of rain that does not stop, of a single family warned to build a vessel to survive what others could not. In this story, the flood is not local. It is cosmic, a reset of creation itself. Was the ancient flood truly global? Perhaps not. But to those who watched the sea claim their homes, the distinction would have been meaningless. When the land that defines your existence vanishes, the world has ended, regardless of what remains beyond the horizon. This is how memory scales disaster. An event that reshapes a region becomes a story that reshapes belief. Over generations, the geography blurs, the details expand, and the flood grows larger than life. What began as a real, traumatic displacement becomes a moral narrative, a cosmic lesson encoded in myth. Not because people lied, but because they remembered. Water, unlike fire, leaves fewer scars that endure for millennia. It erases as it advances, covering its tracks beneath layers of sediment. Cities drowned quietly. Fields vanish without ash. All that remains is absence and the stories told by those who escaped it. In that sense, the flood that transformed the basin did not need to destroy the entire world to become the flood. It only needed to destroy one world completely, and to do so in a way that could never be fully explained by the people who lived through it. The sea had crossed a line it was never meant to cross, and once it had, there was no returning to the way things had been. Even when the water finally stopped moving, its story did not. Those who fled inland carried more than loss with them. They carried memory, heavy, unstable, and incomplete. Over time, the details blurred, but the feeling remained. The sound of rushing water, where there had once been silence. The horizon collapsing into a single advancing line. The sense that something ancient and dependable had turned hostile without warning. This is how floods become more than floods. Long after the shoreline stabilized and the basin transformed into a saltwater sea, the people who survived were no longer the same people. They were displaced, reorganized, forced into new relationships with land and with one another. Archaeologists notice it in subtle shifts, new tools appearing in unfamiliar places, farming practices migrating across regions, settlements forming suddenly where none had existed before. Movement leaves fingerprints. Across Europe, the Near East, and beyond, stories began to circulate. They did not all sound the same, but they shared a structure. There was a time of abundance. There was a warning, often ignored. There was water that rose too fast to escape. And there were survivors, few, chosen, or simply lucky, who carried the memory forward. One of the oldest versions appears not in the Bible, but in Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, a text far older than Genesis, the gods decide to erase humanity with a flood. One man is warned. He builds a vessel. He survives while the world is washed clean. When the waters recede, life begins again, chastened and altered. The similarities are difficult to ignore. These are not casual resemblances. They extend beyond plot into detail. The overwhelming rain, the bursting of subterranean waters, the sense that the flood is not merely weather, but a force of judgment. Yet nowhere in these stories do we find precise measurements or maps. The geography dissolves into symbolism, because the goal is not accuracy, his preservation. A story that survives thousands of years does not do so by recording facts. It survives by carrying meaning. This is where the Black Sea flood hypothesis becomes more than geology. It becomes a lens. If a real event uprooted entire populations and forced them to migrate outward, then those populations would have brought their stories with them. As generations passed, the memory of a regional disaster could easily expand into a vision of global destruction, not because the tellers intended to exaggerate, but because the trauma demanded scale. Imagine trying to explain to your children why your homeland no longer exists, why the fields of your ancestors lie beneath water you will never reclaim, why familiar paths lead nowhere. The language of our land quickly becomes the language of the world. The sea that took everything. You knew becomes the sea that took everything. In this way, myth is not distortion. It is compression. It takes the overwhelming and renders it speakable. Critics of the flood hypothesis are right to caution against literalism. Geological evidence does not support a single flood covering every continent simultaneously. Ice cores, sediment layers, and regional records tell more complex stories. Water rises at different times, in different places, for different reasons. But this misses the deeper point. The question is not whether the flood happened everywhere. The question is whether it happened powerfully enough somewhere to fracture human memory and reassemble it into story. And all evidence suggests that it did. Even if the Black Sea inundation covered far less land than early estimates proposed, even if the water rose over months rather than days, the effect on those living at its edge would have been apocalyptic. Early agricultural societies were tightly bound to specific landscapes. Their survival depended on familiarity, not mobility. To lose land was to lose identity. From that perspective, the flood did not need to be instant to be unforgettable. It only needed to be irreversible. As the centuries passed, the story continued to evolve. Gods replaced tides. Moral failure replaced geological inevitability. Survival became obedience. Destruction became cleansing. What began as an encounter with unstoppable water transformed into a narrative about human behavior and divine response. This transformation did not erase the truth of the event. It translated it. When ancient texts speak of the fountains of the great deep breaking open, they may not be describing a physical mechanism in scientific terms. They may be expressing the terror of watching water come from places it had never come from before, from below, from within the earth itself, from directions that defied expectation. To the people experiencing it, the ground had betrayed them. That feeling does not vanish with explanation. Even today, when we understand hydrology and climate systems, floods still carry a sense of violation. They feel personal. They feel deliberate. They feel as though something fundamental has gone wrong. For early humans, that feeling would have been magnified by the absence of alternatives. There was no rebuilding upstream, no compensation, no return, only movement forward into uncertainty. And so the flood story did what all enduring myths do. It anchored chaos to meaning. It gave the survivors a way to speak about what they had endured without reliving it in raw form. It allowed later generations to inherit not just the facts of loss, but the weight of it. And it preserved, beneath layers of theology and symbolism, a memory of water that once rose high enough to end a world. Not the world, but a world. Not every apocalypse arrives as fire or water. Some announce themselves through a trembling you feel before you hear anything, at all a subtle unease in the ground. A vibration that seems to come from inside your own body. Roof tiles begin to rattle. Lamps sway. Animals behave strangely. And then, without warning, the earth moves. On the morning of November 11, 1855, the city of Idawat, we now call Tokyo, was going about its routines, when the ground beneath it lost its stillness. The shaking did not come in gentle waves. It came violently, tearing through streets and homes with a force that turned solid ground into something fluid and unreliable. Buildings collapsed. Fires broke out almost instantly, racing through densely packed neighborhoods faster than anyone could contain them. Roofs shattered mid-air. Walls split and folded in on themselves. By the time the movement stopped, as many as 10,000 people were dead, and vast sections of the city lay in ruins. For modern observers, this was a powerful earthquake, one of many in a seismically active region. For the people of Edo, it was something else. Japan sits along the volatile rim of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where tectonic plates grind, collide, and slip with relentless regularity. The land experiences thousands of earthquakes every year, and a disproportionate number of the world's strongest quakes occur in or near the Japanese archipelago. To live there is to accept that the ground is never fully at rest. But in the 19th century, the mechanisms behind this restlessness were unknown. Plates were not sliding. Stress was not accumulating and releasing. From the human perspective, the earth simply decided to move. And when something moves without visible cause, the mind searches for a face to give it. In the days following the Edo earthquake, a curious image spread rapidly through the devastated city. Woodblock prints appeared on street corners and in marketplaces, depicting a giant catfish with wide eyes and a mischievous grin. Sometimes it thrashed violently. Sometimes it laughed. Sometimes it lay pinned beneath a massive stone, straining against its restraints. Its name was Namazu. According to the growing legend, Namazu lived beneath the islands of Japan, buried in the dark waters under the earth. When it flicked its tail or shifted its immense body, the ground above it shook. Earthquakes were not random. They were the movements of a creature too powerful to be ignored. Namazu was not an entirely new idea. Long before the Edo quake, people had noticed patterns that felt impossible to dismiss. Fishermen spoke of catfish behaving erratically in the hours before tremors, rising to the surface, twisting and thrashing as if disturbed by something unseen. These observations were repeated often enough to lodge themselves in the public imagination. They were not entirely wrong. Catfish are extraordinarily sensitive to changes in their environment. Their whiskered barbels and specialized skin allow them to detect subtle shifts in electrical and magnetic fields, as well as pressure changes in the water. Before an earthquake, when stress builds in the crust and releases faint preseismic signals, catfish often respond visibly. To the scientific mind, this is biology. To the pre-scientific mind, it is prophecy. By the 17th century, the image of Namazu had taken hold. The creature became both culprit and explanation, a way to make sense of an invisible force that struck without pattern or mercy. But the myth did not portray Namazu as purely evil. It was ambivalent, reflecting the complex relationship people had with disaster itself. Namazu was restrained, according to legend, by the god Takemikazuchi, a thunder deity and warrior tasked with holding the catfish in place. He pinned it beneath a massive stone, the Kanamishi, driven deep into the earth, to keep catastrophe at bay. When the god's grip was firm, the land remained still. When he loosened it, even briefly, Namazu moved, and the world shook. After the Edo earthquake, depictions of Namazu multiplied. Some showed the catfish wreaking havoc, toppling buildings and laughing at human suffering. Others portrayed it, distributing coins to common people, while wealthy merchants watched their fortunes crumble. In these images, destruction and redistribution were intertwined. The earthquake had not only destroyed homes, it had reset society. Carpenters, laborers, and builders found work amid the ruins. Money flowed downward. Old hierarchies were shaken loose. In this context, Namazu became a symbol of Yona-Osha world correction, a painful but necessary rebalancing. The apocalypse, in other words, was not just an ending. It was a reordering. This dual role is what makes the Namazu myth so revealing. It shows how humans do not simply fear disaster. They integrate it. They assign it purpose. They turn it into a mechanism through which chaos becomes meaningful, even useful. The idea that monsters cause earthquakes is not unique to Japan. Earlier traditions in the region spoke of dragons and serpents beneath lakes and mountains, writhing when angered. Over time, these creatures evolved into a more familiar form, one drawn from daily life, from rivers and nets and markets. A catfish, something ordinary made extraordinary. Even today, the echo remains. The stones said to restrain Namazu can still be seen at Kashima Shrine, protruding from the ground, like a reminder that stability is temporary. The Japanese Meteorological Agency uses a cartoon catfish in earthquake safety messaging. Street signs in Tokyo carry its image, warning of quake-prone roads. Half symbol, half censor. Namazu endures because it represents a truth that science has not erased. Nature often knows before we do. The earth sends signals. Animals respond. Humans notice patterns and wrap them in story. In this way, the earthquake is no longer just a geological event. It becomes a dialogue between the unseen and the observed, between fear and explanation. The monster beneath the earth is not real, in a literal sense, but the need to imagine it is. When the ground moves, certainty collapses. Buildings fall. Lives end. And the illusion of permanence fractures. Faced with that reality, the human mind does what it has always done in moments of existential threat. It gives the apocalypse a name. Beneath the surface of every civilization, monsters wait. Not because they exist in flesh and scale, but because the human mind needs them there. When disaster strikes without warning, when the ground convulses, when cities burn, when certainty evaporates, people search instinctively for something to blame. An unseen force demands a shape. An invisible threat demands a face. Namazu was one such face. Across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, earthquakes have almost always been attributed to creatures that live below. In some traditions, it is a serpent coiled beneath the world. In others, a dragon thrashing in its sleep. Sometimes it is a bull shaking its horns. Sometimes a turtle shifting the weight of the land on its back. The forms differ, but the logic remains the same. When the earth moves, something beneath it must be alive. This pattern is not accidental. Earthquakes are uniquely destabilizing disasters. Fires can be fought. Floods can be fled. Storms can be waited out. But earthquakes offer no direction, no enemy, no escape. They turn the ground itself, our most fundamental reference point, into a source of danger. When the earth betrays us, reality feels inverted. An inversion demands explanation. In Japan, The monster beneath the land became a catfish because it fit both observation and familiarity. Catfish were known to behave strangely before earthquakes. They lived in the water, close to the earth. They were common enough to feel real, but mysterious enough to feel capable of anything. Namazu was not imported from distant myth. It rose organically from lived experience. The same is true elsewhere. In ancient Greece, earthquakes were attributed to Poseidon, god of the sea, whose trident struck the earth and split it open. In Mesoamerican traditions, the world itself rested on unstable foundations, subject to collapse and rebirth. In parts of South America, serpents beneath the land were said to writhe when angered, cracking mountains and swallowing villages. These myths were not attempts at deception, they were attempts at control. By assigning earthquakes to beings gods, animals, monsters, people could negotiate with them. Offerings could be made, rituals performed, stones placed, shrines built. Even if the disaster could not be prevented, it could be contextualized. It could be placed within a system of cause and effect that felt comprehensible. This is why Takemikazuchi matters as much as Namazu. In the Japanese myth, catastrophe is not unrestrained chaos. It is the result of a lapse in vigilance. The god tasked with holding the catfish still loosens his grip, even briefly, and the consequences ripple outward. Order fails not because the world is meaningless, but because maintaining it requires constant effort. This idea resonates deeply. But there is another layer to these stories, one that becomes visible only in hindsight. Without language for tectonic plates, subduction zones, or seismic stress, ancient observers still recognized patterns. Earthquakes clustered in certain regions. They repeated, they followed periods of calm. Animals reacted before humans noticed anything wrong. The ground sent warnings, even if no one understood how to read them. Monsters were the narrative interface for that incomplete knowledge. They allowed people to say, something is happening beneath us, without knowing exactly what that something was. They preserved the intuition that the earth is active, dynamic, and capable of sudden release. In doing so, they carried forward a truth that science would later articulate more precisely. And like all effective narratives, they evolved. After the Edo earthquake, Namazu prints did more than express fear. They commented on society. Some depicted the wealthy being crushed beneath falling buildings, while common laborers benefited from reconstruction. In these images, the earthquake was not just a disaster, it was a critique. A force that leveled social hierarchies as ruthlessly as it leveled architecture. The monster became a mirror. This is a recurring feature of apocalyptic myths. They rarely depict destruction alone. They depict judgment, renewal, or correction. The end of one order implies the possibility of another. The monster does not simply kill, it resets. And that idea carries power. When people believe disaster has meaning, they endure it differently. Suffering becomes part of a larger pattern. Loss becomes a chapter rather than an ending. Even fear becomes manageable when it can be named. This is why monsters beneath the earth persist long after science explains earthquakes. Even with seismographs, early warning systems, and tectonic maps, the experience of an earthquake still feels ancient. The shaking bypasses intellect and strikes the nervous system directly. In that moment, knowledge fades, and instinct takes over. The ground moves, and something deep inside us remembers a time when we had no explanations at all. The monster returns. Not as belief, but as sensation. Whether we call it tectonic stress or a restless creature makes little difference in the moment when the ground begins to move. All that matters is the same realization, repeated across cultures and centuries. The earth is alive in ways we do not control. And when it stirs, we listen for monsters. There are places that do not end in fire or trembling, but simply fade. They shrink first, almost imperceptibly. A shoreline moves back, a forest thins. A familiar path becomes marshy underfoot. People adapt, because adaptation is what humans do best. Homes are rebuilt farther inland. Camps shift with the seasons. The land feels different, but still usable, still survivable. For a long time, Doggerland ended this way. Thousands of years ago, this vast stretch of low-lying terrain connected what is now Britain to mainland Europe. It was not a narrow bridge, but a living landscape of rivers, wetlands, forests, and open plains. Herds moved across it. Hunters followed. Families settled, fished, and buried their dead in soil they believed would always remain beneath their feet. Doggerland was not a frontier, it was home. As the Ice Age loosened its grip, the seas began to rise. At first, the change was slow enough to feel manageable. Rivers widened. Coastal forests drowned quietly. Marshlands expanded. People adjusted their routes, their tools, their habits. Generation after generation learned to live with less land, but still enough. This gradual loss is easy to underestimate. Slow disasters rarely feel like disasters at all. They feel like inconvenience, like adaptation, like a new normal. By the time anyone recognizes what is truly happening, the threshold has already been crossed. By the time Doggerland had shrunk into a patchwork of islands and peninsulas, people were still there. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities clung to the remaining high ground, living with the sea pressing in from every direction. The land was fragile, but it was familiar. And familiarity has a gravity of its own. Then, far to the north, the seabed collapsed. Off the coast of what is now Norway, an immense mass of underwater sediment, hundreds of cubic miles of it, gave way and slid into the depths. The movement was sudden, violent, and irreversible. When that much earth shifts at once, the ocean above it cannot remain still. A tsunami formed. It raced outward across the North Sea, its energy spreading in all directions. In some places, the wave rose higher than a two-story building. Along the coasts of Scotland, it surged miles inland. For Doggerland, sitting barely above sea level, there was no buffer, no cliffs, no escape. The wave did not announce itself. There were no distant warning signs. No tremors felt beneath the feet of those living on the low ground. One moment, the land existed. The next, it was gone. When the water finally receded, Doggerland did not return. The fragile remnants that had survived centuries of rising seas were erased in a single day. Villages vanished without trace. Campsites disappeared. Paths, burial grounds, hunting routes, all were swallowed and sealed beneath layers of sediment and water. Unlike cities destroyed by fire or stone, Doggerland left no ruins to rediscover. It left absence. Modern knowledge of the land comes not from walls or foundations, but from fragments dragged up by fishing net, stone tools, bones, antlers pulled from the seabed by accident. Radiocarbon dating tells a stark story. After the estimated date of the tsunami, human traces simply stop appearing. It is as if the lights went out. Across northern Europe, echoes of a lost land linger in story. In Wales, tales speak of a sunken kingdom drowned after negligence and pride. In Brittany, legends describe a city consumed by the sea when sacred boundaries were violated. In each case, the pattern is familiar. A fertile land, a warning ignored, and water that arrives too fast to outrun. These are not precise memories. They are emotional ones. For those who survived the loss of Doggerland, perhaps by chance, perhaps by distance, the trauma would have been profound. A homeland that had always existed, that had seemed as stable as the sky, was erased without leaving a place to return to. No rebuilding followed, no reclaiming, only migration. And migration reshapes culture. When people are forced to move suddenly, they carry their stories with them. Over time, those stories detach from geography and attach to meaning. The lost land becomes a symbol. The sea becomes a moral force. The destruction becomes deliberate, even if it was not. This is why Doggerland is often compared to Atlantis, not because Plato described it accurately, but because Atlantis serves the same function. It is the memory of a place that vanished, preserved as a warning about impermanence and hubris. Whether the connection is direct or symbolic matters less than the role it plays. Both stories remind us that land is not guaranteed. Doggerland's disappearance challenges a comforting assumption that civilizations always leave visible traces. Sometimes they do not. Sometimes the earth and sea conspire to erase them so completely that only myth remains. And myth, in these cases, is not exaggeration. It is survival. It is the only way to remember something that left no monuments behind. Today, the North Sea covers what remains of Doggerland. Waves pass overhead. Ships cross without noticing. Beneath them lie the bones of animals, the tools of hunters, and the outlines of rivers that no longer flow. A world ended there. Not with fire, not with judgment, but with water rising just high enough, and one final wave arriving fast enough to make sure nothing familiar ever surfaced again. Sometimes the apocalypse is quiet. There is no wall of water, no fire falling from the sky, no trembling ground to warn that something has gone wrong. Instead, the world simply grows dim. The sun rises, but it does not warm. Light returns each morning thinner than the day before, drained of color and strength, as if passing through ash that never clears. In the year 536, this is what people across the northern hemisphere began to notice. The sun no longer looked like the sun. Contemporary observers did not describe an eclipse. There was no single moment of darkness, followed by relief. What they recorded was far stranger and far more unsettling. The sun, they said, gave light without brightness. It shone like the moon. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and the sky remained wrong. For 18 months, the light did not recover. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, temperatures fell. Summers turned cold. Crops failed to ripen. Snow fell out of season. Harvests collapsed, not in one region, but across continents. For people who depended entirely on predictable cycles of growth, the implications were immediate and terrifying. This was not a bad year. It was the end of normality. Modern science points to a massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, possibly elsewhere in the high northern latitudes, as the trigger. The eruption hurled enormous quantities of ash and sulfur-rich aerosols into the upper atmosphere, where they spread globally, forming a veil that reflected sunlight back into space. The planet cooled. Tree rings from this period show it clearly. In Scandinavia, oak trees all but stopped growing. In Ireland, records speak of famine. In China, chroniclers note summer snow and widespread crop loss. The world's ecosystems faltered in unison. For those living through it, there was no concept of atmospheric circulation or volcanic aerosols. There was only the growing certainty that the sun itself had been damaged or worse, withdrawn. Historians sometimes call 536 the worst year to be alive, and the description is not hyperbole. Hunger weakened populations already strained by instability. Malnutrition spread, and just a few years later, in 541, the Justinian plague erupted, sweeping through weakened societies and killing millions. To those who survived, the sequence would not have felt coincidental. Darkness, cold, hunger, death. It looked like a pattern. And patterns invite interpretation. In Northern Europe, these years may have seeded one of the most haunting prophecies in human mythology. Norse tradition speaks of Fimbulwinter, mighty winter lasting 3 years, with no summers in between. Crops fail. Brothers turn against brothers. The world grows cruel and cold. It is the prelude to Ragnarok, the end of the gods, and the collapse of the cosmic order. The parallels are difficult to ignore. Analysis of tri-ring data from Denmark shows drastically reduced growth, not only around 530 C, but again, around 540, suggesting repeated climatic shocks. Archaeological evidence points to abandoned villages and collapsing agricultural systems. In Sweden and Denmark, large hoards of gold were buried during this period. Ritual offerings, likely made in desperation, as if attempting to bribe unseen forces back into favor. Even art changed. Sun symbols, once common in decorative objects and carvings, begin to disappear from the archaeological record. It is as if the culture itself lost faith in the reliability of light. When the sun fails, symbolism tied to it becomes painful, even dangerous. From this perspective, Fimbulwinter does not read like a metaphor invented from nothing. It reads like cultural memory, an attempt to encode prolonged suffering into a narrative that could be remembered, shared, and understood by future generations. The world grew dark, and people remembered. The idea that apocalypse comes with fire and noise is comforting. In a way, it suggests drama, a moment you can point to and say, that is when it happened. But the events of the 6th century show a different face of the end, a slow, grinding unraveling of the systems that sustain life. No single day marked the disaster. Instead, hope eroded. Each failed harvest narrowed the future. Each cold summer deepened fear. Each unexplained death reinforced the sense that the world had fallen out of alignment. When the gods were imagined bleeding into the sea at Ragnarok, it was not because people believed literally in divine corpses, but because they had lived through a time when even the most fundamental guarantees seemed to die. And once again, myth did what history alone could not. It gave shape to despair. It allowed people to say, this has happened before, even when it felt unprecedented. It turned suffering into prophecy, and prophecy into endurance. Through story, the darkness became survivable. The sun eventually returned to its former strength. The sky cleared, crops recovered, but the memory did not fade. It settled into language, into belief, into the quiet fear that the light could fail again. Because once you have lived through a year when the sun itself seemed broken, the idea of an ending no longer feels abstract. It feels remembered. By the time the stories reach us, the endings have already softened. Fire becomes metaphor. Flood becomes morality. Monsters become symbols. Even the darkest winters are wrapped in poetry and prophecy, their sharp edges dulled by repetition. But beneath every ancient apocalypse story lies the same quiet truth. Someone was there when the world stopped behaving as expected. Someone watched a city vanish in light brighter than the sun. Someone fled from water that refused to retreat. Someone felt the ground turn against them. Someone lived through a year when the sun itself seemed to fail. And they remembered. Across cultures and centuries, these memories were not preserved as data, but as narrative. Not as measurements, but as meaning. Early humans did not separate the physical world from the spiritual one. When disaster struck, it was not merely an event, it was a message. The sky, the sea, the earth, the light itself appeared to act with intention. So intention was assigned. This is why ancient apocalypses feel personal. They are not distant catastrophes observed from safety. They are intimate experiences of loss, confusion, and awe. They speak in the language of judgment and monsters, not because people were naive, but because they were trying to articulate something that shattered their sense of order. Science now gives us mechanisms. Airbursts, sea level rise, tectonic stress, volcanic winters. But mechanisms do not erase memory. They coexist with it. Even today, when satellites track storms and sensors measure tremors, disaster still feels ancient when it arrives. The ground shakes and instinct overrides knowledge. The sky darkens and unease spreads faster than explanation. In those moments, we are closer to our ancestors than we realize. This is why these stories endure. Not because they predict the end of the world, but because they remember ends that already happened. Worlds that were complete to the people who lived in them. Worlds that mattered. As the narration slows now, as the images fade into silence, one idea remains. Perhaps myths are not warnings about what will come. Perhaps they are echoes of what has already been survived. The sky has fallen before. The sea has crossed its boundaries. The sun has failed. And still, humanity continued. Quietly, carefully, carrying memory forward. Until someone else was ready to listen.